Well, we made it. The end of the year is upon us, and if you've been following the channel, you will have seen that throughout the year I've been participating in the 2025 Criterion Challenge. I urge you to go back to the beginning. There's a whole playlist with all of the videos in there from this year. You can catch up on them and you can see what the challenge actually is. But essentially, the broad strokes are that I was tasked with watching 52 films over the course of the 52 weeks of 2025. I kind of can't believe we made it to the end already. I have a totally separate video coming out tomorrow where I offer a wrap up, a conclusion video to the whole Criterion Challenge. In this one, I just want to run through the final 13 films that I had to watch, give you my thoughts on those. Spoiler alert, this whole thing, I would say, goes out with a whimper instead of a bang. But anyway, let's get into it. This is the kind of movie that doesn't so much play by its own rules as it gleefully sets the rulebook on fire, scatters the ashes about, and then pisses on those ashes. I was going to call this batshit insane, but for once that cliche kind of undersells it. Imagine if Scooby-Doo, Looney Tunes, and a particularly violent migraine collaborated on a haunted house story. That's House. Now, I admire that. I really do. I like when filmmakers go so far off the rails that they're not even on the same track anymore. Obayashi basically invents an entire visual language from scratch, and that's exciting in theory. In practice, watching House sometimes felt like trying to read a book while someone is blasting the trombone in your ear. By the 30-minute mark, I wasn't watching the movie so much as I was surviving it. And yet by the final act, the absolute chaos centerpiece, I realized pretty grudgingly that I was impressed. The effects are dazzling for 1977, sometimes goofy, but also genuinely impressive. Transitions between scenes don't just move the story forward, but they reinvent how transitions can even work. But the sound design, a total nightmare. The music drowns out the dialogue, then screeches to a halt, then lurches into something else entirely. Watching this movie is like getting constant whiplash, visual whiplash, auditory whiplash, narrative whiplash. And then there are the girls, gorgeous, fantasy, kung fu, melody, sweet prof, and Mac. It's a neat idea having these girls represent their personality types like a horror movie Spice Girls, but after a while, the trope of fantasy sees something terrifying, everyone dismisses her, kind of gets old. Kung Fu literally battles flaming logs and then just shrugs it off as just an illusion. It's funny, sure, but it also makes you feel like you're the crazy one. But look, here's the thing. No one goes into House for subtle characterization or airtight logic. You watch it because the visuals are insane in a way that still feels fresh almost 50 years later. Melody gets eaten by a piano. Kung Fu's dismembered legs kick a haunted cat painting to death. The house fills up with blood. A man is turned into a pile of bananas. At one point, the film turns into a silent movie with sprocket holes while the girls provide commentary like they're riffing with Beavis and Butthead. If you describe this stuff out loud to someone who's never even heard of this movie, you sound like you're losing your grip on reality. And watching this film kind of feels about the same. And yet, it kind of works in fragments. House is the kind of movie that feels built for 30-second Tumblr clips circa 2005, the sort of thing you'd send to your friend at 2 a.m. with no explanation. As a whole, it's kind of exhausting, but in pieces, it's kind of brilliant. So, final verdict, I don't know. I think I admire House more than I actually enjoy watching House, but sometimes admiration is enough. And besides, how many movies can honestly say they make you feel like you're hallucinating while you're fully sober? And also, I tried fitting in a Dr. House reference somewhere in here, and I just couldn't do it, so here it is. Dr. Gregory House. Now, the only Hamaguchi film I'd seen before this was Drive My Car, which was a bit of a tough sit for me, and I think the best place to start is with the idea of slow burn cinema. Some films are flamethrowers. They're loud and immediate, but Hamaguchi makes candle flame movies. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. There's a scene here where the protagonist just chops wood for 2 minutes straight. No cuts, no score. That's the vibe. The premise is pretty simple. There's this small woodland community that finds out a group of corporate types from Tokyo are planning to build a glamping site nearby. The villagers raise environmental concerns. The company gives flimsy answers, and that tension becomes the film's backbone. It's a pretty familiar setup, this rural community versus corporate development. And look, I'll just say it, a lot of this bored me. Yes, the film has its moments of beauty. Yes, it gestures at themes about the ecosystem, community, and the ripple effect of upstream decisions, but I found myself struggling to latch onto anything emotionally. At one point, a villager says something meant to sound profound, that actions taken upstream affect those downstream. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the film treats this obvious truth like a revelation. And the ending of this movie doesn't help. The final 20 minutes go into opaque, almost surreal territory. It's shocking, sure, but also confusing in a way that didn't feel earned. I walked away more puzzled than moved. And yet, I don't think the movie is shallow. I just think its themes don't land with the impact that the film seems to think that they do. Hamaguchi's naturalistic style is very present here, but the dialogue is clipped and declarative, with every character speaking in absolute statements. The corporate developers are written so flatly that any moral complexity sort of disappears. It starts to feel like a straw man version of the conflict. The cinematography swings between gorgeous images of nature and shots that look like they could have been filmed on an iPhone. The performances are understated to the point of feeling kind of weightless and airless. And while the film hints at a critique of modern urban intrusion into self sustaining communities, the delivery is so restrained that the message never really gets a chance to land. Now, some of this might be cultural distance. I'm American, watching a Japanese film deeply rooted in rural Japanese bureaucracy and customs. But even accounting for that, the pacing was a big hurdle for me. I used to have far more patience for films like this. Lately, maybe because of YouTube and Instagram, and they've rewired my brain, or maybe I'm just aging into impatience, but I need more than an extremely subtle, slow burn with an ending that disappears into fog. In the end, Evil Does Not Exist drifted past me. A few images linger, and I admire Hamaguchi's control, but the film left me with very little to hold on to. Maybe that elusiveness is the point, but it didn't resonate with me. Now, I've been on a bit of a Kurosawa kick this year, and Seven Samurai made it immediately clear why he's treated like the mythic figure that he is. Even at 3.5 hours, this movie never felt long. After the intermission, I don't think I blinked. I expected a formal, stately samurai epic, and what I got was a whole lot of mud, rain, chaos, and a kind of frantic modern energy. One of the film's most impressive achievements is how clearly it communicates geography. Once the samurai arrive at the village, you intuitively understand the layout, where the bandits might come from, where the villagers should defend. It never feels like exposition, just clean visual storytelling. The performances are incredible. Toshiro Mifune, in particular, is operating on an entirely different frequency. He's feral, he's hilarious, and he's pretty heartbreaking. His character mocks samurai honor while desperately wanting to belong to it. And somehow he's also comic relief and tragic core all at once. But Takashi Shimura grounds the film with a calm, weary wisdom, and the ensemble as a whole is just fantastic. Kurosawa directs actors like he's conducting an orchestra. Every movement, every bit of blocking tells its own story. It's also impossible not to see this movie's DNA everywhere. Sure, The Magnificent Seven is the obvious remake, but its influence runs far deeper. How ensembles are introduced, how tension builds around a location, how action rhythms work. Seven Samurai feels like the moment that cinema learned how to do certain things. Watching it in 2025, it's wild to realize how many modern filmmakers are still working from its blueprint. That said, I don't think calling something a classic means that it's perfect. Some of the samurai aren't developed enough for their deaths to land emotionally. A few function more as archetypes than fully drawn people, so when they do fall, the impact is a little bit more tactical than tragic. And the whole love subplot between the young samurai and the farmer's daughter feels like a detour in a film that otherwise feels pretty laser focused. But honestly, none of that undermines the film's power. From the moment the bandit scouts appear, the movie locks into an anxious rhythm that just doesn't let go. We never see the bandits as characters. They're just this threat circling the village, which makes their presence feel mythic, almost supernatural. And despite all the gravitas, the movie can be surprisingly funny. Every time a bandit got knocked off a horse and then 20 villagers swarmed him like angry ants dogpiling on a cricket, I honestly couldn't help but laugh. Not because it's played as a joke, but because the visuals are so wild and oddly joyful. In the end, Seven Samurai feels like cinema discovering itself in real time. It's huge, it's alive, and it's still astonishingly effective 70 years later. It may not be something I revisit constantly, but it absolutely earns its reputation as one of the most important films ever made. I've had the others on my radar for a long time, but I'll admit I've been avoiding it. I'm not much of a horror guy, but it sort of lined up perfectly with my Criterion challenge. And since this fourth quarter had spooky season in it, I finally gave it a shot. To my surprise, it wasn't as scary as I'd hoped. And I know that sounds odd, hoping a horror movie scares you, but I expected something a bit more intense. But still, it nails that classic old fashioned unease: shadows in long hallways, voices in the dark, doors shutting on their own. It taps into childhood fears of big, creaky houses with too many rooms to keep track of. The camera work, the editing, the lighting all work together to keep you just a little unsettled. Nicole Kidman is a standout. At this point, I should probably just admit that she's one of the best actors working, but somehow I keep rediscovering it every time I watch one of her films. She carries this whole movie, her unraveling, her fear, her denial, everything hinges on her. The two child actors are solid, but this is Kidman's show. And I want to tread carefully here because the movie is built around its twists, but even in 2025, it's pretty clear early on that something is off. The film teases its secrets constantly. When we get to the first twist, that I felt a bit underwhelmed. That reveal has been kind of done to death, no pun intended, since The Sixth Sense. But the second twist, that is a little bit more effective. But still, watching this now after 2 decades of twist-heavy horror, it didn't land quite as hard as I imagined it did in 2001. There are stretches where the film loses momentum, especially when the husband briefly appears from the war. He's clearly traumatized, stays for a night, vanishes again, and the plot just kind of stalls. And while the final seance reveal is eerie, the movie immediately dives into heavy exposition that explains the twist in a way that feels just too spelled out. All that said, The Other still holds up as a moody, elegant ghost story. It's not packed with shocks, but it gets the primal stuff right: the darkness, the silence, the isolation, the sense of being watched. And Kidman's performance adds a real emotional backbone the film would be lost without. I could see why it's considered a modern classic, even if it didn't completely floor me. It's atmospheric, it's well acted and thoughtful, just dulled a bit by time and the sheer number of horror films who borrowed its playbook afterward. I'm not itching to rewatch it immediately, but I'm glad I finally saw it. So, Stanley Kubrick and I have always had this up and down relationship. I admire his craft and influence, but I often bump up against the dreaded B word: boredom. Barry Lyndon might be his most patience testing film, and yet it's also one of his most stunning. On a technical level, the movie is absolutely untouchable. No doubt about that. The cinematography is absurdly beautiful. Those NASA made Carl Zeiss lenses are a wild flex, and the candlelit interiors look unlike anything else on film. Every frame is so meticulously composed that you could freeze it and hang it in a museum. The sound design, the costumes, the sheer physicality of the production, it's all incredible. Performance-wise, Ryan O'Neal is an interesting choice. He brings this blankness that actually works in the film's favor. He feels like someone who could slip in and out of society without leaving much of a mark. That's not meant to be a dig at him. I think he's great. You can imagine this character rising into wealth and then fading back into obscurity without anyone remembering him. I do wonder what Robert Redford would have done with the role, but Ryan O'Neal's understated presence fits the film's tone. And going into this, all I knew was that it was a powdered wig British period piece, something that has never been my favorite cinematic territory. Aristocracies, duels, muskets, manor houses. It's just not my genre. And in many ways, Barry Lyndon didn't change that for me. It's beautiful, but emotionally distant. It's elegant, but kind of lethargic. The pacing is aristocratic in its own way. It's slow and formal and detached. I had heard people call the film satirical, but I never really felt the satire. And that's the tricky part, right? Sometimes the satire mimics its subject so closely that it becomes indistinguishable from it. Instead of critiquing aristocratic absurdity, the film often just presents it. Barry himself is kind of hard to pin down, more opportunistic than malicious, more carried along by circumstances than actively shaping them. And because of that, I never felt a strong emotional arc driving the story. The film's back half, after Barry marries into wealth, has a rhythm, but not much pulse. The tension with his stepson is the most compelling thread, yet it takes ages for that to emerge. The climactic duel is fantastic, but it also made me wish that the rest of the story had carried the same emotional weight. Thematically, the movie seems interested in the rise and fall arc of a man who ultimately ends up right where he started, older, poorer, missing a leg. But I found myself asking the kind of question I hate asking, which is, why this story? Why did Kubrick feel compelled to tell it? I wasn't sure what deeper meaning I was meant to take from Barry's trajectory beyond the idea that upward mobility can be kind of hollow. Still, admiration counts for something. The film's craftsmanship is undeniable, and there are sequences so gorgeous that they justify the runtime by themselves. But for me, Barry Lyndon remains a film that I respect more than I ever truly felt. Seconds left me a little perplexed. It's labeled as a cult classic, and Frankenheimer has a reputation for a wildly varied career. But this being my first of his films, I walked away both intrigued and confused about its status. The easy thing to praise here is James Wong Howe's cinematography, which I would say is genuinely outstanding. The wide-angle close-ups, the camera rigged to actors as they move through Grand Central, the sort of paranoia-inducing distortions. It's bold, inventive stuff. Even the whole wine stomping sequence is pretty overwhelming in a deliberately visceral way. And Rock Hudson gives a surprisingly raw, vulnerable performance, playing against type and throwing himself into emotional extremes that I, or a lot of other people, didn't expect from him. The premise is pretty strong. A dissatisfied middle-aged man signs up for an experimental procedure that fakes his death, gives him plastic surgery, and lets him start a new life as Tony Wilson, complete with a new career, a new home, and a new personality engineered by this mysterious shadow company. And then, predictably, it doesn't go well. The problem is that the movie never really digs into the emotional reasons behind his choices. We're told that he's dissatisfied, but I never really felt the dissatisfaction. He's got a nice house, he's got a family, a stable job. There's something gnawing at him, but the film never defines what that something actually is. So when he becomes Tony Wilson and he falls into a romance and then drifts around a California art scene, the whole middle act feels kind of hollow. Conversations are stilted, chemistry is kind of non-existent, and the world around him feels oddly lifeless. The film's biggest issue is just under exploration. It raises fascinating ideas like identity, disillusionment, the fantasy of reinvention, but treats them more like bullet points than actual themes. I kept thinking about the version of this movie that could have existed with just a little bit more character work or emotional grounding. There are also technical limitations that pull you out of the film. Much of the dialogue sounds like obvious post-dubbing and ADR, and long stretches have almost no ambient noise at all. Scenes that should feel eerie instead feel unintentionally empty. It creates this atmosphere of detachment, but not always in a purposeful way. But still, there's no denying the film's visual impact. Frankenheimer and Howe experiment with style in ways that feel ahead of their time, techniques that clearly influence filmmakers like Darren Aronofsky decades later. The third act, especially the final sequence, is pretty harrowing. Hudson completely commits, and the bleakness of the ending lingers. But emotionally, intellectually, I can't say it gave me much. A lot of people seem to bring more meaning to the film than I think the film actually provides. It's been compared to a feature-length Twilight Zone episode, and honestly, I'd probably rather just watch The Twilight Zone. Seconds is full of great ideas, just not fully realized ones. This was my first John Cassavetes film, and I went in knowing his style would be loose, improvisational, and actor-driven. I could absolutely see how this approach influenced filmmakers like Sean Baker and the Safdies, the naturalistic performances, the handheld camera, the feeling that scenes are unfolding messily in real time. I admire the ambition, but I'm not sure I vibe with the style. The first hour feels like one extremely long, inciting incident. The story takes forever to get moving, and I kept thinking the entire film could be told more effectively in about an hour. So much time is spent inside Cosmo's burlesque club, watching performers, backstage chaos, small talk, and improvisation that rarely feels essential to the plot. It's meant to be immersive, but for me, it became repetitive and kind of shapeless. That said, there are compelling stretches. The actual killing sequence is tense and atmospheric. The scene where Cosmo gets cornered in an empty warehouse is pretty gripping. And in the last hour, there's a dressing room monologue where Ben Gazzara absolutely destroys, easily the most powerful moment in the film. Gazzara, in general, is the saving grace here. He gives Cosmo this lived in, weary charisma that the rest of the film kind of orbits around. But too often, the dialogue feels like noise rather than character building. Everyone interrupts everyone constantly, no one finishes an actual thought, and the naturalism ends up feeling kind of alienating rather than organic. I'm sure this style was revelatory in the 1970s, but watching it now, it could feel like sitting in on a chaotic podcast where half the cast thinks they're in a mob movie. My biggest issue is that the supposed main plot, the killing of the Chinese bookie, barely feels like the point. Cassavetes seems more interested in the burlesque house ecosystem than the crime story. What should be background texture becomes the majority of the runtime, while the narrative engine sits idling off to the side. And you know what? It's a concept that I actually like, a club owner getting sucked into debt that he can't pay and forced to kill a man, but the film treats that as the subplot. Stylistically, though, I get the appeal. The grainy handheld cinematography has a certain gritty charm, like a rougher, looser cousin of Taxi Driver, and the contrast between this and something like Gazzara's earlier work in something like Anatomy of a Murder is pretty fascinating. You could practically chart the shift in American filmmaking through him. Ultimately, the movie didn't work for me, not because the choices are bad, but because they don't connect with me emotionally or rhythmically. I'm still curious about Cassavetes as a filmmaker. People call A Woman Under the Influence a masterpiece, but I'm not in a rush to jump back into this specific flavor of improvisational, wandering storytelling anytime soon. Wildlife moved me far more than I expected. I went in knowing almost nothing beyond 1960s family drama in Montana, but it fits into a small lineage of films that I love. Stories about childhood mythology collapsing. Movies like After Sun, Boyhood, Juzo Itami's A Quiet Life, The Last Picture Show. All of those films deal with the moment that you stop seeing your parents as infallible adults and start recognizing them as flawed people shaped by their own unresolved lives. Wildlife earns a place among the best of them. One thing I appreciated immediately is that the film avoids cliches. Given the setting, I expected Jake Gyllenhaal to play the stereotypical abusive, stoic, emotionally distant 1960s father, but he isn't. He's loving, attentive, and emotionally aware, just deeply frustrated by the limits of his own personal circumstances. The real focus ends up being Carey Mulligan's character, Jeanette, who becomes one of the most complex figures in the film. And Mulligan is extraordinary here. I don't know why we don't talk about this performance more. Jeanette is discontent in ways that she can't articulate. She's disappointed in her marriage, in her domestic life, maybe even in motherhood. But instead of confronting her dissatisfaction privately, she pulls her teenage son, Joe, directly into her emotional mess. Her affair with Bill Camp's character is pretty painful to watch, not because it's shocking, but because she drags Joe along with her, literally and emotionally. Mulligan plays her with a mix of shame, yearning, and self-awareness that feels kind of painfully real. What I love is how the film captures the tension between regression and responsibility. Jerry, the Jake Gyllenhaal character, fears moving backward, taking quote-unquote teenager jobs, losing his dignity, while Jeanette seems compelled to retreat into the version of her that feels alive again. Joe is stuck in the crossfire, watching the people he depends on unravel in real time. And Ed Oxenbould is perfect as Joe. He has that sort of every kid quality that makes him an ideal surrogate for the audience. His observations are quiet, they're confused, they're pretty hopeful, and they carry the emotional weight of the film. The cinematography by Diego Garcia is stunning in a subtle, unobtrusive way, and David Lang's score complements the film's restrained sadness. And look, the final image, which I'll spoil here, Joe sitting between his parents in a forced family portrait, hit me especially hard. It perfectly captures what children do when the family structure starts to collapse. They try, however naively, to make the picture whole again. If I do have complaints, they're pretty minor. The subplot with the girl from school feels pretty underdeveloped, like it gestures at Joe growing some independence, but it doesn't quite land or go anywhere. And the climactic moment when Jerry lashes out by burning down Warren's house feels pretty abrupt, almost too quickly resolved. I wanted the emotional crescendo to have a little bit more weight behind it, but even with those nitpicks, Wildlife is a remarkably assured debut from director Paul Dano, who has been in the news lately due to Quentin Tarantino talking shit. I'll set the record straight here and now. Paul Dano rocks. And this film is quiet, it's empathetic and deeply human. It's not flashy, but it lingers. It made me think about my parents, my childhood, the messy humanity behind every family. And that alone kind of makes it special. Now, look, I probably never would have watched Heart of a Dog if it hadn't fit perfectly into the under 80 minutes slot of my Criterion challenge. I went in knowing almost nothing about Laurie Anderson other than her reputation as an avant garde artist. By the end of this film, I still wasn't entirely sure what to make of what I'd just seen. The film plays like a series of diary entries or drifting monologues tied loosely together by Laurie Anderson's voice. It circles around her dog at times, Lolabelle, her life, her death, the grief that followed, but branches off constantly into musings on 9/11, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Homeland Security, childhood memories, her artist friends, and personal anecdotes. Some of these digressions are beautiful or insightful, but others feel like you've wandered into an installation at MoMA that loops endlessly whether you're paying attention or not. There are genuinely moving sections here. Anderson's reflections on love, loss, and spiritual meaning of death land with a quiet emotional weight. But there's also a good chunk, maybe 30 minutes or so, where the film becomes visually repetitive with rain textured filters, archival footage, stock looking images, and long stretches of droning music. It's meditative, sure, but also meandering to the point where your mind starts to drift. And that's the tension at the core of this film. Every time it finds a moment of clarity, it sort of floats away again. Anderson's narration has this dreamy, drifting quality that can be hypnotic in small doses, but eventually starts to feel like listening to a very artsy friend's stream of consciousness monologue. It's not unpleasant, but not exactly riveting either. It made me think a lot of a movie that I love, which is Don Hertzfeldt's It's Such a Beautiful Day, which takes a similar collage-like philosophical approach. But where Hertzfeldt's film has a clear emotional through line, Heart of a Dog feels more like a patchwork of ideas, each anecdote carrying its own individual lessons without a larger thesis tying them together. I kept thinking the film might have worked better as a series of short experimental videos rather than a single feature-length experience. But still, I don't want to be too harsh. The film has enough small wisdoms and unexpected moments of beauty that I don't regret watching it. Its sincerity comes through even when the structure wobbles, and the sections about Lolabelle, her aging, her vulnerability, her death, are genuinely touching and give the film an emotional background. And also a little bit about me. My family had to put down our childhood dog this year, so all the stuff about Lolabelle really did hit me right in the heart. The rest is hit or miss, sometimes poetic, sometimes pretentious, a word I hate using, but I'm using it in this context, sometimes quietly profound. It's exactly what you'd expect from a 75-minute avant-garde essay film from a downtown New York artist deeply into Buddhism and personal reflection. Also, I did not know that Laurie Anderson was married to Lou Reed, which ended up being one of my favorite takeaways of this entire movie. So, Tokyo Story is one of those films that sneaks up on you. For the first 10 or 15 minutes, I thought I was settling into a slow, early 1950s family drama. But as it unfolded and as its intentions became clear, I found myself fully pulled in. By the end, I completely understood why it's considered an absolute classic. The premise is simple. Two aging parents travel to Tokyo to visit their grown children. The kids are busy, they're tired, and wrapped up in their own lives, so they brush their parents off, pawn them off onto other relatives, or shuffle them out of the way. There's no malice in it, just neglect. Neglect that feels painfully realistic. All the parents want is time with their children, and somehow the children can't grasp that. Now, as someone living in New York, a few hours from my own parents, this film hit me pretty hard. Whenever my parents visit me, it's a big deal. I try to make it a big deal, so watching these adult children treat their parents like an inconvenience was pretty brutal. It's a reminder of how easily life swallows people whole, how quickly you could become the person who means to call and never actually does. The movie becomes a meditation on aging, obligation, disappointment, and the way the family bonds warp over time. It acknowledges that children have their own lives, but also argues, quite powerfully I might add, that you still have a responsibility to the people who raised you. It's tragic without ever being sentimental. Like there's a scene where the parents stay at a waterfront hotel right after a wedding, so young people are partying all night and the parents can't sleep. And in the morning, they sit by the water and they talk about how the world has simply moved on without them. And it's devastating, not because it's dramatic, but because it's so ordinary. Yasujiro Ozu's filmmaking style is fascinating. The low tatami level camera, the frames within frames compositions, the calm, precise staging, all of it creates a sense of stillness that makes the emotional punches land harder. It reminded me of Juzo Itami's The Funeral. Sorry I keep talking about Juzo Itami, but he's a big deal for me right now. It's another film that kind of finds humor and heartbreak in the rhythms of Japanese domestic life. And despite how heavy the film gets, Ozu still finds room for humor. The ending moment of the neighbor walking up to the window and casually telling the newly widowed father that he's going to be so lonely now before strolling off just absolutely killed me. Whether Ozu intended it or not, it was kind of darkly hilarious. Do I think this is one of the greatest films ever made? I see why people might make that argument. It's pretty timeless, it's universal, and emotionally clear without ever feeling manipulative. But I don't know that it's a film I'll revisit often. And that does knock it down a bit for me personally, but still, it's absolutely something that everyone should watch at least once, if only to remind yourself to call your parents. Let this video be your reminder. Call your parents. Now look, Michael Haneke is a filmmaker that I had a mini obsession with in high school and college. Cache, Funny Games, The White Ribbon, Amour. Haneke's cold, punishing style can feel kind of revelatory then, but getting older though, I hit what I'd call my sincerity era. The world is already bleak enough, and suddenly Haneke's brand of despair just becomes a bit harder to stomach, and The Seventh Continent landed right in that shift for me. I went in completely blind. I didn't know the plot, just that it was Michael Haneke, so I expected to feel kind of hollowed out afterward. What I didn't expect was how quickly my attention would drift. For the first hour or so, the film is almost entirely just an Austrian family moving through their daily routines. And watching it, I kept wringing my hands together going, okay, this has to be building towards something devastating enough to justify this level of restraint. And then when the final act arrives, what unfolds is undeniably horrifying, but it's also oddly lifeless. Because Haneke keeps the characters so distant and emotionally opaque, especially the parents, George and Anna, that the film never quite lands with the shock that I anticipated. Their final decision doesn't feel surprising or even out of character. It just feels kind of inevitable. That's where I struggled most. I found myself wishing that the story had been told by a filmmaker more interested in character, someone who might have let us connect with the family before stripping everything away. Michael Haneke presents them as robotic from the outset, which makes the horror feel more conceptual than emotional. And look, there was a time when I would have been fully on board with this approach. There's a moment where we watch money being flushed down a toilet in close-up for over a minute, a scene that apparently caused an uproar at one of the festival screenings. 18-year-old me would have thought that that was the coolest shit imaginable. 29-year-old me was checking his watch the whole time. The film is clearly open to interpretation, but what I took from it was the frightening ease with which ordinary people can arrive at unthinkable decisions. The story is based in real events, so Haneke is obviously reaching for something beyond provocation alone, but his fixation on despair and cruelty feels a little too predictable here, and the payoff ends up feeling kind of foreseeable rather than devastating. That said, the craft is kind of undeniable, the imagery is striking, the use of sound is fascinating. There's no non-diegetic music, just the sounds of the world itself. Visually, it's cohesive and brutal. You've got this gray, brutalist buildings, cold interiors, an aesthetic that feels like playtime if it were stripped of all of its joy. And I understand why people are deeply affected by The Seventh Continent, but for me, it doesn't stack up against Michael Haneke's best work. Too many factors: timing, expectations, distance, keep it from landing the way that I had hoped. All right, I'm gonna be pretty blunt about this one. I have no idea what the was going on with this movie. I read that David Bowie wasn't sure what they were making while they were making it, and that obviously tracks. The film is pretty perplexing. It's fascinating to look at, sure, but narratively, it's all over the place. In some alternate reality, this story probably plays as a straightforward sci-fi drama about an alien who comes to Earth, becomes a multimillionaire by inventing new technologies, and then tries to build his own space program to return home. Those story beats exist in this movie somehow, but Nicholas Roeg buries them under a mountain of incongruent fragments, unnecessary nudity and sex scenes, dreamy, psychedelic imagery, character decisions that defy logic, dialogue that feels like nonsense, and almost zero explanation for anything. There's no real sense of stakes, no grounding tension, and it takes ages for the movie to even confirm that Bowie is an alien in the first place, something any viewer could guess just from looking at him for one frame. But the film also refuses to clarify time in any coherent way. Characters age by years or decades between scenes with barely a mention, but somehow some characters seem to age faster than others. Even the world building is pretty inconsistent. David Bowie's character invents all of this technology that's supposedly revolutionary, so game-changing that his patent lawyer turned company president for some reason claims that he could buy out major corporations like Kodak, but we barely see any of this innovation, and decades later, people are still listening to vinyl records in record shops. This film gestures to futurism while clinging to the present in the 1970s. I get that Nicholas Roeg wanted this to be an art piece, and the movie toys with ideas about media consumption, corporate power, and the numbing effect of television, but I don't think it ever lands on a real thesis. Most character interactions feel so baffling that it's like everyone, not just David Bowie, is an alien to us, the viewers. And also, on a total side note, I did not expect to see David Bowie hang dong in this movie, or Rip Torn for that matter. All that said, I could absolutely understand why the movie has a cult following. It's visually inventive and consistently interesting to look at, and if you don't mind a story held together with loose vibes and hallucinations instead of coherent logic, the film probably works better. David Bowie's performance is actually pretty solid in this, considering all of the chaos around him. I just wish I could see the version of the movie that was more linear, more grounded, and less reliant on trippy transitions and vague character motivations. I can't say I enjoyed it much, but I'm not mad at it either. It's inconsistent, it's confusing, it's messy, but it's still weirdly admirable, and you should probably just check it out for yourself. So for my final Criterion Challenge film of 2025, I watched Rainer Werner Fassbinder's The Merchant of Four Seasons, and you may recall me saying back at the beginning that this year ended with a whimper instead of a bang. Yeah, this was an unusual one for me. I'm a bit on the fence about it. Emotionally, I felt pretty distanced from the film while watching it, but after sitting with it, reading some other perspectives, I've come to appreciate that it's doing something more intellectually rigorous than I initially gave it credit for. The film follows Hans, the black sheep of an upper middle class family in Munich. After returning from the war, he becomes a fruit salesman, pushing a cart through the streets, a job that his mother sees as deeply beneath him and shameful. Hans, you see, was fired from the police force for sleeping with a prostitute, which also explains why he joined the Foreign Legion in the first place. Now he lives a working class life, desperate for acceptance from his mother, his sister, his brother-in-law, and especially his wife, who still doesn't fully trust him after the whole, sleeping with a prostitute thing. In classic Fassbinder fashion, the film unfolds as a slow domestic melodrama, a portrait of a deeply flawed man who just wants to be seen and valued by the people closest to him. The challenge with a film like this, especially one from the early 1970s Germany, is navigating the cultural and generational distance. Hans is not an easy character to like. Early on, the film's central turning point is him getting so drunk that he brutally beats his wife. She threatens to leave him, he suffers a heart attack, and while he's hospitalized, she takes on a lover who later ends up working for them at their fruit stand. The film takes several winding narrative detours like that one, including Hans recruiting an old military buddy of his to help with the business. When the fruit business finally becomes successful, Hans finally gains some respect from his wife and from his mother, but only conditionally. Their affection is tied to his productivity or his status, not to him as a person. That to me feels like the emotional core of the film, love that is transactional rather than unconditional. And that's pretty cool, but my main issue lies in the presentation. The acting can be inconsistent, the cinematography swings between striking, beautifully bold compositions and awkward ones, and the pacing often feels pretty sluggish, despite the film being under 90 minutes long. Character motivations are sometimes painfully obvious and other times completely baffling. Some of that is likely cultural distance. People behave and speak in ways that feel alien from a contemporary 2025 American perspective, but it still creates this emotional friction. By the end, Hans makes a decisive choice. I'm not going to tell you what it is here, and the near total lack of reaction from those around him left me feeling pretty removed from the humanity of the moment. I often felt pulled between emotional engagement and pure emotional detachment. So The Merchant of Four Seasons didn't knock my socks off, and it didn't immediately make me want to dive headfirst into the rest of Fassbinder's filmography, but it is a solid, important film, one that clearly helped launch his career, and for anyone interested in the history of German cinema, it's probably essential viewing. But there we go. That does it. That is quarter 4 of my 2025 Criterion Challenge. I urge you to go watch quarters 1 through 3. Maybe starting in 2026, you all can join me in the Criterion Challenge. It's 52 films, 52 weeks, all various genres, eras, countries of origin, all of it. We really did it. I couldn't have done it without you. I want to thank everyone out there who found my channel this year and stuck around through all of these videos. You know who you are. And just a reminder, tomorrow I will be putting out a video that is sort of a conclusion, a wrap up, all of the things that I got out of the entire Criterion Challenge in 2025. It's going to be a bit of a doozy, so I hope you enjoy that. Don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out on this channel next year. And then you can go follow me over on Letterboxd where you can see what I'm watching, when I'm watching it, and I'll see you all next time.